This briefing is a part of a series of discussions JPC is hosting called The Scoop on Annexation or Sovereignty. With 1 day left before Israel's expected announcement on a decision regarding the declaration of sovereignty over areas in the West Bank, more questions than answers seem to be surfacing. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with the co-authors of War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Published this April, although it is an adaptation of a book published in Hebrew 2 years ago, it is still very timely, and one might ask if the authors knew about the Prime Minister's plans. Dr. Einat Wilf was a member of Knesset with the Labor and Independence parties between 2010 and 2013, during which she was on the Foreign and Defense Committee. Prior to her parliamentary work, she served as foreign advisor to late President and Deputy Prime Minister at the time, Shimon Peres. Since leaving public service, she has continued to work to impact policy through think tanks, including the Washington Institute and the Jewish People's Policy Institute. And she's also written 5 other books in the field. Thank you for joining us, Einat.
My pleasure.
And we also have with us Mr. Adi Schwartz, a journalist formerly with Haaretz, who focuses on key issues related to the conflict. Adi continues to write as a freelancer and is completing his doctorate in political science at Bar-Ilan University. His expertise is in the Palestinian refugee issue and the history of Jews in Arab states, also a related topic. Mr. Schwartz, thanks very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having us.
So before we begin, I'd like to point out that Einat and Adi have generously agreed to share copies of their books with the journalists on the line. So you should receive a digital copy with instructions for downloading them in your email later today. Please reach out to us directly if you have any questions before the end of the week. Okay, so we'll begin with some questions about the new and improved book, and then address the imminent Israeli and American plans for the area. Questions will be at first directed to both of you, so I guess we can keep a consistent order, perhaps of Einat answering and then Adi answering, unless you'd like to do it differently, before we get into a few questions personally for each of you. Okay, so you argue in the book that the failure to achieve a solution to the conflict is the result of the inability of the Palestinians to let go of the so-called right of return. Now, you both define yourselves as liberals. Perhaps in Israel this does not come as a surprise, but many of our colleagues around the world might say that a thesis placing much of the blame on Palestinian shoulders does not fall in line with liberal ideas. How would you respond to this?
So both Adi and I, this book for us is a bit of call it a coming of age story or a story of a journey, because we both grew up and very much believed in the reigning assumption of how Israel should make peace in general with the Arab world and with the Palestinians specifically. And the reigning assumption throughout the 80s and the 90s, where Adi and I were very much supportive of Meretz and the Labor Party, was the idea that Israel can achieve peace by means of an exchange of land for peace. And especially with the Palestinians, this meant the West Bank and Gaza. And for us, what devastated us, and in that sense, we almost stand in for much of the Israeli peace camp in the 90s, was that in the year 2000 and later in the year 2008, 2 Palestinian leaders, Arafat and later Abu Mazen, walk away from strong, concrete opportunities to realize this land for peace exchange, to have a state for themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, entirely sovereign in the territory without settlements, with capital in East Jerusalem, and they walk away. And not only do they walk away, what follows are waves of violence, and especially the wave of the early 2000s was really one of just bloody massacres. And a lot of Israelis from the peace camp, and Adi and I among them, began to ask, what do the Palestinians want? If they walked away from 2 concrete opportunities to end the occupation, to have their state, what's going on? And we both realized through meetings with Palestinians and ultimately through our research is that the answer was staring in plain sight all the time. that the Palestinians have been telling us what they want. We just either didn't listen, or when we did listen, we just didn't take it seriously. They told us that what they prize above all other is this thing they call the right of return, which, as we show in the book, is neither a right nor, by now, for the millions who claim it, is it a return. And what they are basically demanding, that they have in their mind an internationally sanctioned right for millions of Palestinians to settle in breach of Israeli sovereignty inside the state of Israel in its pre-1967 ceasefire lines. And this means that whenever Palestinians, even today, when they say just today we'll go back to the negotiating table, when they say that they support a two-state solution, as they have for the past 20 more years, but in the same breath, they say, when they are being asked and pushed, they say that the right of return is sacred and holy and individually belongs to millions of Palestinians, then the numbers are such that the only two states they ever envision in a peaceful resolution is a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. There has not been to date a single Palestinian peaceful vision in which Israel is allowed to stand as is at the end of the process as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. And therefore, our book discusses, of course, how all of this came about and was developed and indulged by the West. But ultimately, it presents it as a very simple obstacle. There cannot be resolution and peace by means of a two-state solution when one side is completely unified. There's no dissenting voice on that, unlike Israel, completely unified in their vision that the Palestinians, millions of them, possess this so-called sacred right of return into the sovereign state of Israel.
Thank you, Einat. And Adi, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that at this stage, it's okay. I'm fine.
Okay, so if you'd like to begin by answering the next question first, that would be good. The Palestinian issue has been sidelined throughout the West, as well as by Arab states, in place of seemingly more significant developments, such as the Syrian civil war and its refugee crisis, the war in Yemen, Iran nuclearization, and its escalation with the US and with the Saudis, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. Is the need to address this narrative still relevant today?
Yes, I think very much so, and I'll tell you why. Of course, we have bigger problems such as COVID-19, etc. But if you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're talking about a different time span. We're talking about decades and perhaps even more than a century if you look back to where it all began. So if you are looking at the main question that we ask in the book is, why don't we have peace? Now, I hope that COVID-19 will be over in a few months or in a year or two. But as it seems now, until a very serious and concrete effort will be made, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will remain with us. So I do hope that some kind of vaccine will be found to COVID-19 and we'll get through this tough period. But the problem that we present in the book will remain with us. It has been with us for a few decades. And what we're trying to say is that until now, unfortunately, since 1948 actually, the wrong message has been sent to the Palestinians. We give examples in the book of how other refugee situations were solved. The phenomena itself of refugees is not unique to the Arab-Israeli conflict. By the way, there were Jews who were fleeing, who had to flee Arab countries. But in much bigger numbers, we had refugees in Europe after World War II. We had millions of refugees fleeing India and Pakistan, etc., etc. Whoever knows the history of the 20th century, unfortunately, it was a very bloody century, and we had millions and millions, tens of millions of refugees. None of them no refugee from the 40s are still with us. Why is that? It is not because refugees themselves don't want to go back. Many refugees did like their former homes and want to go back. But the international community usually, and here is the exception with the case of the Palestinians, the international community has sent a very clear message that if the war is to be over, then people move on with their lives. There is no return, they're not going back, because the scenario is very simple. If refugees go back, the war starts over. And that was the case in Europe after World War II. Nobody wanted to open up the war. That was the case in Asia, in Africa, in many other cases. And the international community made it very clear that return as a solution is not viable, is not going to happen, and certainly is not going to be sustained. Only exception to this, and this is really the only exception, is the case of the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, in which not only that the international community did not send a clear message, it created a special UN agency, UNRWA, which after a few years became, in fact, an agency of perpetuating the refugee situation and not solving the refugee situation. So the message was exactly the opposite what it should have been. And for 72 years, the Palestinians are getting financial aid. UNRWA's annual budget is more than $1 billion per year. And there's a support diplomatically. And to the best of our knowledge, no European leader, international leader, UN spokesperson or UN Secretary General ever came to the Palestinians and told them very clearly, listen guys, the war is over, you can resettle yourselves, you can build a beautiful future to yourselves in Palestinian cities, for example. We could help you build your own education system, health system, etc., but we're not going to sustain an image of millions of Palestinians who want to return, by now it's not a return because it's the 4th or 5th generation, into the state of Israel. So this has not happened. And even if our, short-term problems will be solved next week or next month, or hopefully as soon as possible, this major problem, until it will be tackled, Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not be solved, just like this. Just like trying again and again the same method that we have been trying for the last 30 years. We have to tackle the main issue, and it is the vision of the Palestinians that through return, they can someday undo the state of Israel.
Just a follow-up question before we proceed. You also claimed that UNRWA's policies themselves actually encourage terrorism. Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly, one of the most shocking realizations for us working on the book was to discover the major role that UNRWA played in forging a very particular kind of Palestinian nationalism. What actually happens is once UNRWA becomes this organization, still temporary, but constantly renewed, which is responsible for all the schooling of the Palestinians, this is the moment that Palestinians are forged as a single nation with a collective purpose and a collective understanding of history and the future. Now, the connection between education and nationalism is Nationalism 101. And there's nothing wrong with the forging of a new Palestinian nation in the refugee camps. The problem is that the kind of Palestinian nationalism which is forged in the refugee camps is one which is singularly focused on revenge and return. And that's where it feeds very directly into terrorism. We tell in the book the story of the perpetrators of the Munich massacre, which those who are still alive and hiding are very proud of. In order to murder and mutilate Israeli athletes in an Olympic, you have to truly believe that you're doing it for a just cause. And that kind of mindset is the mindset that is forged in the UNRWA refugee camps. The mindset of the Palestinians as a people who have been dealt a unique injustice in world history, unparalleled, and one which every one of them has the commitment to rectify by means of undoing the state of Israel, by means of violence, by means of terrorism. So it's no coincidence that the perpetrators of the plane hijackings, the big terrorist events of the 70s, of the 80s, and all the way to the present are children of the refugee camps, are children of the UNRWA schools, because in their mind, being focused on return, on getting back in their minds, the land which is only and only theirs, is a holy purpose for which they need to sacrifice everything. And that also really tells you the understanding of Palestinians as agents in history. One of the things that I'm very proud of that our book does is I think it finally gives the Palestinians the respect of listening to what they're saying and taking them seriously. And that when they say that they're marching for return in Gaza on the border of Israel, when they say Palestine from the river to the sea, they mean it, they're serious about it, and they're willing to sacrifice quite a lot in order to keep fighting for it. In fact, they're willing to make what we might think is the ultimate sacrifice, is to repeatedly forgo having their own state, having the dignity and liberty of having a state of their own in part of the land, if the price of having that state, and that has always been the price, is to forgo any notion that they will have a mass return of millions into the sovereign state of Israel.
Okay, so if then the message, as you both have put it, has been wrong, the message that was given to the Palestinians, how would you think the Palestinians need to rethink their narrative, and how does this message reach them? I mean, you've published books in Hebrew and in English. How is it getting to them? How is it going over their leaders and to the street directly?
So first of all, we hope very much to be able to publish this book in Arabic as well. But until then, one of the reasons that we wrote this book in English as well is as a message to the international community, to the United States, to European countries, mainly to donor countries, because they have the ability to deliver this message. Many European countries, the European Union, the United Nations are in touch with the Palestinian leadership, with Palestinian other groups or NGOs. We're not naive. We don't think that a book by two Israeli Jews will make a huge change just like that in the Palestinian society. But what we're trying to achieve is to change the narrative and indeed to change the course of the ship. And I want to give you an example, perhaps to make it easier to understand what we're trying to achieve. And this is the example that we detail in the book of West Germany after World War II, where no less than 12 million refugees, German refugees, had to flee Czechoslovakia and Poland, what became Poland, what earlier was the eastern territories of Germany. And this happened after the war in 1946, so it wasn't part of the war. We show in the book that these deportations were very brutal. They happened after the war, and more than 12 million such German refugees arrived to West Germany. Now, they wanted to return as well. They created their own organizations, politics. If you follow the West German politics after World War II, you know that they were a significant force. They had the party of their own, rallies, newspapers. They had some sympathy from other politicians, etc. But slowly, as I said before, the international community sent them a very, very clear message to Germany that there's nothing to talk about. There isn't going to be any such return. And even a leader such as Willy Brandt, who was a leader of the opposition in the 60s, while Adenauer was the chancellor, was supportive of that demand. But came 1970, and Willy Brandt signs peace treaties with Poland, recognizing the eastern border of Germany, and saying actually that those eastern territories are gone or lost. And is not only signing a peace treaty with Poland, he delivers a speech to his fellow German citizen, and he's telling them, listen, guys, we have to look forward, move on. This is part of the past, and this is the right thing to do. Now, in West Germany, this took 24 years, right? From 1946 to 1970, where a very clear message by all the surroundings was sent to the Germans, to the West Germans. And this narrative, this scenario is what we hope to achieve. And we hope for a Palestinian Willy Brandt to come one day to his fellow Palestinian people and tell them, listen, guys, those territories which you think you will one day return to are over. That's it. That's the state of Israel. We have to think about the future and build our future. Again, that can be in Ramallah, in Nablus, in Hebron, etc., or in Gaza Strip. But the state of Israel is here to stay. So this is the narrative. This is the scenario that we hope to achieve. Certainly, no financial aid and institutional aid such as UNRWA can continue on behalf of the West, and a very clear message in all ways, in all means, diplomatic, political, financial, etc., all means possible. This message should be transmitted from the international community to the Palestinians so that we can have a Palestinian Willy Brandt. Perhaps it will take less than 24 years, but if it happened with Germany, why not here? So this is the way forward as we see it.
Let me just clarify, you're advocating for a complete end of financial aid to the Palestinians in order for them to move to the next stage of their narrative? We're advocating for an end of financial aid as long as it is channeled towards this dream of returning. If Western countries want to promote the Palestinian Authority in terms of their healthcare or their education system, certainly not through UNRWA. If they want to help some self-government in for the Palestinian Authority, that I don't have any problem with that, just as many countries in the world give aid to many other countries. What I'm saying is that this aid, which is channeled through UNRWA to sustain this world of returning one day, you have to understand, when a kid is just born while we are speaking, and UNRWA automatically grants him a refugee status. While I am talking right now, I assume that babies are being born in Gaza, in Khan Yunis, and in Ramallah. Now, they can be fourth and fifth generation by now of people who were born there, and automatically the United Nations gives them a card, a refugee card, and now they are refugees. Now, the question is why? And where are they refugees from? So people who live in Gaza, by all means, they are going to stay in Gaza, right? Israel has taken out all military posts, all civil settlements, etc., etc. There is now a Palestinian rule. Okay, it's Hamas, but still it's Palestinian. So obviously, all the people who are right now in Gaza are going to be in Gaza. So why is he a refugee automatically receiving services? There's no sense in it. Now, if you ask the Palestinians, they know exactly why they are refugees. They are refugees because their real home, as they see it, is inside the state of Israel. This is the kind of aid that I want to stop. I want to stop an agency which is called UNRWA. I want to stop sending them the message that they're refugees and all entitlements with it, the healthcare, education system, etc., etc. If then the European Union, for example, wants to build schools in Gaza, by all means, I have no problem with that. The issue here is a political issue, a refugee status and all entitlements coming with it, and a worldview that comes with it, that there is no place for the state of Israel. Understood. I just have one question left on the issue of right of return, even though you both have made yourselves very clear, but it is a follow-up question because I would like to get to annexation or sovereignty because we're nearing the end of our call. Please keep your answers as brief as possible. Would a return of refugees to a Palestinian state be acceptable in case both parties do actually agree to a two-state solution, if there is an agreed return?
So having a Palestinian state that can enact its own immigration laws, certainly every state in the world has immigration laws that privilege one group over another. Either they privilege an ethnic group or historic group or certain financial and educational criteria. But every country in the world has an immigration law that privileges a certain group. If the state of Palestine wishes to establish an immigration law that privileges those that they see of Palestinian descent, of course. But there can be no peace which is based on the demand that currently is the overwhelming demand, that Israel recognize that millions of Palestinians have a right to breach Israeli sovereignty and to settle in Israel despite what Israel decides, which is what the Palestinians demand. Already in 2000, with the Ehud Barak proposals and the Clinton parameters, the Palestinians could have had a state in which they have an immigration law that Palestinians can be naturalized in Palestine. But they walked away from that because that's not what they want. Just so we understand, 40% of the so-called refugees live in the West Bank and Gaza. So when a Palestinian state is properly established there, they will not be going anywhere. They will be staying in place. Another 40% are citizens of Jordan. So we're really only talking about other Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon or maybe somewhere else. So yes, a Palestinian state should be sovereign to determine what are the criteria for immigration and naturalization in Palestine. What a peace agreement cannot have is a demand that Israel forever has an open clause that every person who sees themselves as a descendant of Palestinian refugees can settle in Israel in breach of Israeli sovereignty. Such an idea exists nowhere in international law.
Okay, so how will this week's announcement impact the future of the Palestinian narrative? If you can both respond, it will be good because we know what you think about the topics up until now, but this is something kind of new to deal with. Adi, if you can begin.
So I think that for now, since we're not yet discussing a whole package, right? There is no understanding and there is no negotiation over what's been called the deal of the century or the Trump plan. We're talking about a very specific issue, which is whether Israel, we don't know yet, will or will not, and we don't even know if yes, how large is this annexation or annexation, let's say. So we don't know the details, but in my view, any such act will not add to the possibility of having peace, but will not harm it. So one of the things that we analyzed in the book is that at the end of the day, at this stage, the problem or the conflict is not about territory. It's not yet about territory. We wished it would be about territory, and then it would be very easy because drawing borders on maps, it's not that easy, but it's easier than where we are today. So we hope to reach the day when the issue and discussion will be about borders. So for now, if Israel decides to annex 1, 2, 3, 5%, 10%, we don't know the numbers, I don't think that it has anything to do or to add to conflict resolution. In any case, we're talking about conflict management, some, this or that way, but I don't think that such a decision will have an impact on the possibility of having peace. Again, the main issue here is changing for a long term the Palestinian mindset, which is still not even at the point of drawing the maps and the borders.
Einat, do you feel the same or differently?
Certainly. The problem with the discussion on annexation is that it continues the old discussion that the problem is land for peace, or all the things that are related to land, occupation, statehood, settlements, pre-1967 lines. As long as the conflict is and remains about the Palestinian idea that all of it is theirs, that they need to undo the injustice of 1948, then any discussion about land is utterly irrelevant. We can only really discuss it, the land, the borders, and then, by the way, annexation will become reversible, right? Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, and then in the 1990s proceeded to have very serious negotiations with Syria over handing them over. Israel discussed land swaps with Palestinians, which means it discussed giving over territory it really possesses. So the application of law, sovereignty, annexation is reversible if we finally get to a situation where Palestinians are ready to discuss land and borders rather than this overwhelming demand for return. And I've been following, of course, this debate very quickly, very closely, participating in it as well. There's a lot of good reasons why not to annex. The only reason, which I refuse to accept as a valid reason, is that it will kill the two-state solution, because that analysis completely misses the fact that the two-state solution was never alive for a single minute because of the Palestinian vision of return. A two-state solution, as envisioned initially by the UN, a Jewish state and an Arab state, is one that the Palestinians are yet to accept. Only once this is their vision too, only once they say, okay, we want to negotiate now, but we accept that the Jewish people have a historical claim to this land, that we are both deserving of self-determination, that they are not foreigners, and that we both need to have our own nation state in this land, and that the Jewish people will have their nation state, and we will not seek to undo it by return. Only when Palestinians can say that openly and clearly to us, to their people, and then we can have a fairly simple negotiation of borders and security arrangements and all that. But that is the discussion that can only happen once the underlying issues are resolved. In the book, we say it in a very simple way. For peace to happen, the war must end, right? It's really banal. If you want to have peace, there has to be a recognition that the war is over. But from the Palestinian perspective, the war of 1948 is very much an open file, which they still hope to win by means of return.
Okay, so carrying on from what you just said in terms of the rejection of the Jewish state's right to exist at all, would you agree with the statement that many of the right are making, that perhaps creating facts on the ground, such as a declaration of sovereignty, can actually encourage such a recognition?
I know that they're making this argument, but I find it to be a roundabout argument rather than deal with the direct issue itself. Because what we're saying, and in that sense, I'm still very much a member of the left and the peace camp, is the Palestinians do have to go through the painful process of reformatting their identity to accept the equal legitimate claim of the Jewish people on this land and to move away from return. But I think that the best way to get to that end is to deal with the issue directly, because what also needs to happen is that once Palestinians undergo this transformation, which I believe is possible, it's not assured, but it's possible, there has to be a space for them where they can build their state, which is why I continue to oppose the settlement project, and especially the part of it that I call the enmeshment project, the part that is deep within the West Bank. So in that sense, I don't see the value of Israel continuing to enmesh itself in the West Bank. I think we need to deal directly with the core of the conflict rather than looking for roundabout ways. The core of the conflict has always been and remains the Arab-Palestinian rejection of the Jewish right to self-determination in any part of the land, in any borders. It is at this moment most expressed through this overwhelming demand for return, and that Israel recognize that the Palestinians have this right. And only when you can get the Palestinians to slowly and painfully move away from that demand, to do the Willy Brandt speech, to understand that the war of 1948 is over, then we can have a discussion on borders. And my position is that it's better to have fewer settlements when we get to that discussion, but I don't think the settlements make a difference in getting the Palestinians to accept the permanence and legitimacy of the Jewish right to self-determination in this land.
Do you look like you also wanted to respond to that?
I agree. I think that, I know, for example, if you read Ron Dermer's op-ed in the Washington Post, then this is the case he's making. He says that the problem, by the way, the analysis is correct, that we did not have peace until now because the Palestinians are yet to accept the notion of a Jewish state, and then perhaps application of Israeli rule over parts of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, might help create that atmosphere. But I'm also in favor of simply going directly. If that is the purpose, then why not doing it directly? I mean, we have very direct tools. By now, the most evident tool that the Palestinians envision to achieve their goal is the issue of refugees and return. By now, there are millions. The Palestinians count 5.5 million refugees are registered by UNRWA, but even more. They count 8 and 9 million scattered all over the world, supposedly having this right of return, which is not a right, as we just explained. So why not tackle it directly? Why not say, you're not refugees, there is no right of return, dismantle UNRWA? I mean, there are much more direct methods. And by the way, I think will have bigger impact, because imagining that if we annex this or that square kilometer in the West Bank, somebody will understand, okay, perhaps, I'm not sure, but I think that there are more direct ways, which I'm more in favor.
Understood. A question that's just come in. Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas recently said that he is not looking for a return to Sfat. Do you think this indicates a change, perhaps, in the aspirations in the narrative?
So this is an excellent example of how Israel and the West understand one thing and the Palestinians speak very clearly in a different way. We are so eager to see that there is a real possibility of peace that sometimes I compare Israelis to eager teenagers who get half a text and say, oh, she loves me. Abu Mazen was very clear in his wording. He said that he personally does not expect to return to Tzfat, and he's happy where he was born, and he's fine with going to visit there with a passport. But he immediately made it clear, and Israelis, of course, you're right, Israelis hopped on and said, oh my God, Palestinians are readying themselves to give up this right of return. But he immediately made it clear to his people that he was making a personal statement. This is a key element of how Palestinians conceive this right of return at once collectively and individually. They claim that each Palestinian possessed it individually, and therefore no negotiation can ever give it away. So Abu Mazen was saying, this is my personal choice. He made it very clear, and he said, but every Palestinian through the generations possesses this right, and it's sacred, and I cannot negotiate it away. And his son and grandson, who were not actually born in Tzfat, immediately went on YouTube to say, this is our grandfather's personal choice, but we're going back, we're returning, and they're the ones that actually are not returning. It's not their birthplace. So this is an excellent example of how we so deeply want to believe that in the possibility of peace that we latch on to even the most minor indication when it's not there. And therefore, in the book, we also argue for enough with this indulging of Palestinian signals. We want to hear clear words. The time for ambiguity is long over. We want to hear clear words that, like Willy Brandt, that say, it's over, there will not be return. In fact, there is no such right. The lands that are now the state of Israel will never be ours. No one will be returning there. It's not ours. We can build a future in the West Bank and Gaza in an independent Palestinian state. But as long as we continue to gamble this future in order to keep fighting for return, we will have nothing. The Jewish people are not foreigners. They're equal claimants to the land. We need to hear clear things and stop making excuses for why they're not saying them, and stop looking for signs. They can speak clearly. Once they speak clearly, we will know that we are, in my view, on the very quick path to peace.
Understood. I'm just going to say that we've gone a little bit over time, but because we've promised to ask as many questions as possible that the journalists sent, we'll extend a little bit over if I may. But let's put a cap on it. We'll be done at 10 minutes to 12, and we'll get through as many questions as possible. Okay, so Einat, you chaired the Knesset subcommittee on World Jewish Communities, and you were also a fellow at the JPPI. Do you think this specific move this week, the annexation or claiming of sovereignty over parts of the West Bank, could impact Israel's relationship with parts of the diaspora?
It could, I think, because mostly no one understands why and what for. And in that sense, I think Jews abroad are a lot like Israelis. The vast majorities of Israelis don't know what's going on. They don't know why they need it. They don't know why they're being bothered with this at this particular moment. Of course, there will be many of our haters who will continue to use it to their advantage. The only problem is by now I figured that those who are against Israel and Zionism, they've long divorced themselves from what Israel actually does in making their arguments against Israel. And I can tell you that one of the things we see from the reception of the book by Jews abroad is that they really find it refreshing, revelatory to go back to the core discussion of what the conflict really is, rather than all the noise that they've been bombarded with for decades now.
And a somewhat related question, how do you explain the alignment of anti-Israel groups in the West with civil rights activists, as we've seen in the past with the Women's March, and most recently in the fight against racism, reignited after the murder of George Floyd?
That's, of course, less about the book, but I do think that what we're seeing is the disappearance of the old liberal left, which was very much supporter of Zionism as a movement to self-determination, and the emergence of, call it, an illiberal left, which is more focused on the Soviet-style thought policing. And in that sense, it took the entire Soviet package of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism, and it has permeated very much their worldview, their argumentation, which is why it has nothing to do with what Israel actually does. I mean, when you study the Soviet anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism, you see how the imagery used, the language used today, specifically, for example, apartheid, racism, those were created in the Soviet labs, so to speak, and they're very much permeated the West in this illiberal, the emergence of this illiberal thought policing left.
Okay, Adi, is there room for a similar refugee narrative for Jews who were expelled or forced to flee from Arab countries in the last century? This being your field, was there ever an attempt by such groups to win international support or even compensation?
Okay, so I'll answer this in a minute, but just to add to what Einat said, I think it's a process that has started back in the 60s when the very leftist, even Marxist intellectuals became biggest supporters of people from Castro to even Khomeini. We remember that Michel Foucault thought that the Islamic Revolution is a beautiful thing, and by which you found very liberal, tolerant, open intellectuals living in Paris and in London, supporting the most brutal and anti-human rights dictators on earth. So this trend inside liberal or leftist thought, which is indeed on the illiberal side of the left, has been with us for decades. And I think it's worth a few books in itself. So this is just to add. Now, in terms of Jews who had to flee Arab countries, so yes, there were almost 1 million Jews living in Arab countries, from Morocco in the west and to Iraq and Iran in the east. And the issue is that they were never a part of a war. They were simple and very peaceful citizens, so it's not the same thing as the war that Israel had with the Palestinians in 1948. The Jews who had to leave Baghdad in 1950 or 1951 had to flee, not because they fought the Iraqi state, but because Iraqi state and Iraqi society considered them as enemies of the state. They were Jews, and therefore they had to leave the country. So there are also very big differences, very important differences. Now, Jews who had to flee Arab countries, most of them came to Israel, but others to France, Canada, and other European states, from day one, wanted to build new lives. If you look at the beginning of the 50s, Jews who came from Iraq, from Yemen, they lived in similar circumstances, such as the refugees, the Palestinians one. They lived in what has been called their ma'abarot. What was the ma'abarot in Israel in the beginning of the 50s? Cities of tents, very low quality, very low standard of life. But from day one, first of all, they received citizenship. They were naturalized automatically in Israel, something that the Palestinians did not want, certainly not in Lebanon and Syria, and did not get. And they decided to build their lives. So they did not dream and talk all day long about those old houses they had in Iraq. Of course they have. Of course they're sentimental. They think about it. They listen to Iraqi music perhaps. But there isn't that notion of clinging to the past and demanding something which everybody understands is not going to happen. By the way, they don't want to go back to Iraq. Their history of centuries of living as a minority under Muslim rule. We all know that Jews in general lived as a second class or even third class minority. Jews were never received equal rights or equal treatment by the society. At best, they were tolerated. Tolerated means that, you know, you're being tolerated, but they could never participate in the political act. They could not bear arms. So there were many restrictions on Jews, and therefore they don't want to go back. Their main aspirations always, for people who live in France and Canada and know these communities, was always to excel and to be best as doctors, as lawyers, as politicians, whatever, and not dreaming and going back as citizens to those countries. And of course, the international community, because they were not clinging to the past, has ignored their situation. And most of the people, I don't think, even know about the fact that half of the population of the state of Israel these days are descendants of those peoples who had to flee those countries.
A very interesting parallel lesson. Thank you, Adi. We do have some more questions, but out of respect for everyone's time, we're going to end here. And if you agree, we'll send some of the questions that are left over by email for you to answer. Dr. Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, thank you again for your time this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank our Director General, Uri Dromi, and the JPC's press coordinator, Rachel Gziel, for putting everything together and making sure today's briefing ran smoothly. Please stay tuned for information about JPC's July activities just around the corner. Goodbye, everyone.